moving over to the defensive side of things, we also have a new coach there leading the way for the Duke's defense, and that is Lyle Hemphill. He comes to JMU from Duke, where he was most recently served as the co-defensive coordinator and the safeties coach. What style of defense can we expect to see from Coach Hemphill?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's similar to offensively, where they will adjust based on personnel, and they've got more experience at linebacker than necessarily in the secondary. The defensive line should be pretty solid. I think they're going to want to be aggressive up front, try to get to the quarterback, try to disrupt some things up front because they're, a little less settled and experienced in the secondary. So I think that'll be the case for the defense. And, Hemphill's a guy who there's a lot of energy on the coaching staff in general. But he's definitely a guy who, as he got there, gets on the field, gets out there with the players, you see a lot of, bounce from him, and, players kind of responded to that. So I think it's going to be fast and aggressive kind of defense, which is what JMU fans have kind of become accustomed to. But, as far as, schemes and everything like that, I think there's still some to be determined with that.
We kind of see usually a stumbling of programs when a new coach comes in, because I feel like coaches are pretty stubborn and they want to run this certain offense or certain defense, and they maybe don't have that personnel there that they want to run. And that leaves me like a lot of optimism there for JMU in this next year with this coaching change. Like you've said it multiple times, the coaches are going to coach to what they have. Like they're not going to try to fit a round or a square peg in a round hole. So that's exciting to hear.
Yeah. And I think, some of that comes from, things are a lot different now with the transfer portal, and you're replacing big chunks of your offense. And sometimes you're taking who you can get in the portal, but it also goes back to Chesney too. I think, coming from the D2 and D3 ranks, you see that with, D3 coaches in particular, like, you can either have, a very regimented style, like, okay, we're a triple option wishbone type of thing, and that's all we're ever going to do, and we'll just bring those guys in. Or a lot of D3 coaches are like, hey, well, the kid who wants to come here for engineering also is like a pretty good quarterback, so we're going to build our stuff around him. And, I think that's the way Chesney's kind of always been. And that, we talked about he doesn't have the FBS and the G5 experience, but sometimes that lower level experience can translate in a different way. And I think that's, something we've seen from him, is that his history of being adaptable because he had to be is probably going to show through at JMU too.
Awesome. Well, let's look at that personnel that will help run Coach Hemphill's defense. Let's start with the defensive line. The unit was very strong last year, as they ranked third in sacks per game in 2023 with 3.46. But much like the offense, they suffered a lot of lost production in the offseason. Jalen Green and Kamari Chroma are off to try their luck in the NFL. And then you got James Carpenter, Mikhail Kamara, and Tyreek Tucker, who transferred. They do return Emmanuel Bush and Amar Thomas, among others, and they bring in Terry Lockett Jr. from Syracuse, Lloyd Summerall from South Florida, DJ Cotton from West Virginia, and Eric O'Neill from Long Island. How did that unit look this spring, and did anyone stand out to you?
They looked solid, and, Emmanuel Bush was probably the standout from the spring. A guy who he had been pretty good at Marshall before transferring to JMU, and then kind of got buried on the depth chart a little bit at JMU, because those guys you mentioned that they lost, like it was just an unbelievable performance by the defensive line last year. It's hard to even, put into the words how dominant they were, especially the first probably 8 to 10 games when Jalen Green was there, having an All-American type season before he was lost to a knee injury. They just really controlled the game. The teams couldn't run on them at all. They were getting the sacks, like you said. And that made a difference in the ridiculous run totals because, obviously in college they factor sacks into lost yardage in a running game. But even if you took that out, they were really, really good against a run. And we're playing basically those four guys the vast majority of the snaps, with Tyreek Tucker rotating in a little bit too. And, Manuel Bush didn't see the field quite as much, but I think he's a guy who's probably set to be the kind of the standout of that group this year based on what we saw in the spring.
Moving over to the linebackers, they lose their top two tacklers in 2023, Aiden Fisher and Jalen Walker, but they do return Torres Jones, Trent Hendrick, and Seth Nawatala, among others, and they bring in Raymond Scott from Fresno State, Jacob Dobbs from Holy Cross. How did the linebackers look in the spring?
They looked good, and that's the one where you mentioned some of those guys that are coming in transfers. Definitely helps with depth. Torres Jones coming back, I think, is going to be big. He's a guy who he didn't end up starting most of the games last year. He was an all Sun Belt caliber type of player in 2022, and then he has some nagging injuries early on. And Aiden Fisher gets in there and he ends up having like an incredible season and was too good to really take off the field. And you could see it at times, even at JMU, when you go to the post-game interviews, you kind of have to cut through a hallway that goes right by the locker room. And I mean, there were times like after games where you could see the frustration on Torres Jones' face coming out of the locker room. Like, as soon as they were done meeting, he would go off and kind of like just have to be by himself because he wasn't getting the playing time he wanted after a really good 2022 season. He was going to be in the portal kind of regardless of what happened with the coaching situation. And he went into the portal, but then decided to come out and stay at JMU after the coaching change. And he's a guy who I think has an opportunity and I think has the motivation to kind of get back to that level he was playing at. So it's kind of interesting because you look at, officially who's the returning starters. Torres Jones isn't one of those guys, but he, in a lot of ways, is a returning starter from a couple of years ago. And I think is set for a big year. And then of the newcomers, Jacob Dobbs is coming from Holy Cross. He's joining the staff. And it's almost hilarious. Like, close your eyes and listen to them talk and try to guess which one's Bob Chesney and which one's Jacob Dobbs. Because like he just kind of brings that like entire mentality. Like you can tell he's the leader coming in and the guy who kind of bridged that gap between new staff and players that are coming back. Because he's beyond the fact that he put up big numbers at the FCS level and should be able to play pretty well at the group of 5 level. I think he's just, definitely going to be one of the leaders of this team. A guy who I'll be shocked if he doesn't go into coaching when he's done playing. And he's a name I think you're going to hear a lot in the fall when JMU gets out there and starts playing.
So you think Dobbs and Jones are kind of the two main linebackers for 2024?
Yeah, and I didn't mention Trent Hendrick, but he's another guy who's been good when he's gotten the opportunity to be out on the field for JMU, and he got some starts last year when both Jones and Walker were hurt. They went with Hendrick and Fisher, and there was no drop off really. And Fisher stayed in the starting lineup. Hendrick, was kind of in and out, but they played him a lot last year. Linebacker, the first string anyway, is a place where they're going to look pretty good. I don't know what the depth is going to be like, but their starters should be good at linebacker.
Well, let's take a look at the defensive backfield. They suffered losses this offseason as well, losing D'Angelo Pons, Francis Meeham, Chris Chukwaniki, Q Reed, Devin Coles, but they do return Jacob Thomas, Chauncey Logan, DJ Barksdale, among others. How did that unit look in the spring, and who's going to step up to fill these vacated roles?
Yeah, that's an area where they're still bringing guys in the portal right now. They're still recruiting the portal pretty hard, especially at cornerback. Jacob Thomas kind of had a breakout year at safety last year. And Chauncey Logan's a guy who basically been a starter since his first day on campus at cornerback. So they've got some good players and spots there, but the depth is going to be a question mark. And, how quickly they kind of integrate some of these guys who are still either just committing here in recent days or maybe kind of expected to commit soon as they, I think we don't even know who's necessarily going to be playing cornerback for them opposite Logan in the coming this fall, because that's an area where they're really still trying to piece together a unit.
If you had to pick a defensive player to have a breakout type season in 2024, who would that be?
I could say maybe, just talked about Jacob Dobbs a lot, a guy who, if you just want to call it a breakout, just because he's coming from the FCS level where he was a really good kind of, All-American type of player. And in the past, JMU has had success with guys who have moved up from the FCS to G5, whether it's guys who were already at JMU when they made the transition or guys who transferred in from FCS schools because they wanted to move up too. Those guys have had a lot of success at JMU, and I think he's one of those guys who's going to prove to be a top level FCS player who makes the transition well, and then will kind of just be a breakout because people didn't see him playing for JMU last year, and maybe if you didn't follow FCS football as much, might be surprised that it's a name you hadn't heard a lot, but he'll be out there making a lot of plays.
The last 2 years, JMU's defensive unit as a whole has been really, really strong, especially for the G5. Do you think that that's going to continue? I mean, I think the natural inclination is there's going to be some step back, but I guess how much of a step, if there's going to be a step back, how much do you think there might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think there could be some step back because just like I said, the linebackers were so deep last year that, when they had some injuries, you didn't even see a drop off. And I don't know if something like that's going to be the case this year where they can survive injuries like that. The defensive line was just absolutely dominant last year. A special group that you're not going to put together a unit like that very often, even for a successful program. So I think, there'll be some step back, and that's going to happen. There's going to be some probably growing pains with new staff doing things a little bit differently. They've been very successful defensively, that staff previously. I think when they get their program in place at JMU, we'll continue to think of JMU as a really good defensive team, but it'll be very, very difficult to continue to play at the level where they just took a lot of pressure off the offense last year with what they were able to do defensively.